Welcome to this edition of The Shift Report, the podcast from Mcentric and the Mcentric Foundation. Mcentric is the go-to information and resources hub designed exclusively for the emergency medicine community. The Shift Report podcast is a leading resource for our community to learn more about wellness, innovation, and the business of emergency medicine, along with other areas that are important to you, our listeners. Through the Shift Report, we can all learn from leaders in the field who share key insights and experience. To learn more and to join the community, please visit us at mcentric.org. Today, we welcome Joshua Russell. Dr. Russell lives and works in the Pacific Northwest. Josh is an experienced emergency physician who has expanded his efforts and expertise into the world of urgent care, an increasingly important part of our health system. Through his work at MRAP and the Journal of Urgent Care Medicine, he is working to promote science and evidence in this important area. Welcome, Josh.
Hey, thank you, Till. So good to be here.
Great to have you here. And when we think of urgent care, everybody's probably got their own definition and perhaps their own biases of urgent care. They may or may not have ever set foot in an urgent care center. And we know that there are differences in urgent care around the country. So you're very experienced in emergency medicine, have practiced it, trained in it, and really are working in the urgent care space. First, tell us, what is urgent care versus emergency medicine, and how do we define it, and what are the differences around the country?
You bring up one of the central issues surrounding urgent care is that it does lack a standard definition, and there is, unlike in emergency medicine, not a required nomenclature for any businesses to use to call themselves an urgent care. And there are some laws that are working to change that. But by and large, you can call your medical office an urgent care if you have extended hours, for example, Monday through Friday, or if you're open Saturday morning. And then there's not even a requisite there's not even a requirement to use that term urgent care. So a lot of places, I used to work at one place that, for example, they called it an immediate care. There's minute clinics, and how do those fit into the landscape? But by and large, I look at it as there's a huge number of people that have unexpected things come up in their life. That's, either new symptoms or they injure themselves. And depending on the severity of those symptoms and injury, there needs to be an appropriate landscape and ecosystem to care for them in the most efficient and effective way possible. And sometimes that's, as we've seen, telemedicine taking off. Telemedicine is a viable option. Other times people need to be seen, but it's not either immediately, or if it is immediately, they don't need a lot of services. And so I sort of define urgent care as the care for people with acute illness and injury that doesn't require a lot of equipment, gadgets, staff. So that would be really my ideal definition of urgent care, but there is variability.
No, I understand that. And I didn't exactly prep this question, but I think through the biases I've heard over many years, hopefully I haven't expressed them myself, but I've certainly heard them, and I'm sure you've heard them too. There's an almost a balance or a disassociation between the attitude in emergency medicine of why couldn't they have handled that in the urgent care center when they sent that patient to me, and at the same time with perhaps the next patient, why didn't that patient go to urgent care? Why are they here? And I think that speaks to a little of the misunderstanding of urgent care within emergency medicine. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I've definitely lived it on both sides, so I can understand the frustration. And working in the emergency department, that doesn't come from any ill will towards anyone, I don't think, other than I guess it comes from the fact that you're very busy and seeing somebody who you don't either think needs to be seen at all, maybe, or you don't have anything else to offer, or it comes from the sense that there's somebody who has come in because they're promised a test, and there's some frustration because now the urgent now as an emergency physician, they feel compelled to meet the patient's expectation, order a head CT, for example, that's not indicated. So those frustrations are very understandable. The thing that I try to go back to, though, is that patients really don't know what they need, and urgent care clinicians often don't know what will and will not be sorted out in emergency departments, and vice versa. Unless emergency physicians have worked in urgent care, I think it's very easy to overestimate what can be handled in an urgent care setting. And it was a shock to me, and anybody who's worked in urgent care can probably attest to this, is while your emergency medicine training certainly prepares you for the pathology that you're going to see, and still identifying sick and not sick is it doesn't matter the setting that you're in so much, but it's very, you feel hamstrung. You don't have an ultrasound, you don't have labs, you usually don't have nurses, and you're expected to see these patients with extreme rapidity. So in the same way we work in the ER, and we're often questioning with one patient, why did they come in so soon after these symptoms started? The next patient, we're like, why did this patient wait so long? The Goldilocks phenomenon exists not only in that single setting, but also in terms of where patients end up for care.
So let's put aside mine and others' biases, and let's talk a bit about the strengths of urgent care. I mean, between the pressures on emergency medicine with volumes of patients and what we know is truly a crisis in primary care with diminished resources and reduced accessibility of primary care for patients, urgent care really has an important role to play in the clinical setting that we live in and in the business of medicine. How are you working to improve urgent care and build up or the science of urgent care in our current environment?
You asked a lot of really good questions there. So let me first start with some numbers, just to kind of scope what we're talking about. Since COVID, which we're now this year, 5 months, hard to believe, but there have been more patients seen on an annual basis in urgent cares than in emergency departments by a fair margin. And the point about quality gets to problems with measurement because there's not a repository of urgent cares reporting data in the same way that emergency departments do. But the best we can tell, it's probably about 200 million patient visits per year in urgent care, which is still a bit less than primary care. Emergency medicine is around 150 million. And that just speaks to the reality of life. There are far more urgencies than are emergencies. There are far more symptoms that are mild and of uncertain significance than life-threatening that arise. And we have about 15,000 urgent cares in this country. So in building that access, we've also opened the door to people entering the healthcare system, which can be a good and bad thing. But when you lower that bar to entry, then there's going to be a lot of patients that are going to be seen when they might have otherwise waited a couple days, the symptom resolves, and they don't even end up seeing their primary care doctor. So now we have this situation where a lot of people are entering the healthcare system, and the thing that is the biggest determinant of how things go is what happens in urgent care. And because it is the entry point for the healthcare system, it's really important to get that urgent care visit right. For a lot of patients, this is their only contact with healthcare systems, especially younger patients that don't have chronic medical problems. They might have high deductibles. They often won't have a primary care. And so things like health maintenance are not going to be addressed generally until they maybe end up presenting with stage 4 cancer, for example. Conversely, there are people that are really fine, but they're the worried well who present, and they're at high risk of iatrogenesis if we overtest and overtreat them, if we give them a referral to a specialist that they didn't need, if they undergo an imaging study or blood testing that they don't need. Anybody who's a clinician realizes this phenomenon. When you order, the more tests you order, the more likely you're going to find incidental things, and every incidental thing fuels worry, fuels more follow-up. So the urgent care medical decision-making process really determines the course of that patient's healthcare sometimes for a long time. And sometimes that's good if it's catching something at an early stage, diabetes or hypertension that's not diagnosed. Sometimes it's bad if you find an incidental thing and then you end up sending the patient for a specialist who orders more testing, et cetera. So that is really the critical role that urgent cares play. However, urgent cares, the financial side you can't overlook, but the urgent care currently in the United States 2025, the average urgent care has about a 1% margin. So anyone who has the illusion that urgent cares are, rolling in dough, there may be exceptions. There are certainly ones that are doing better than others, but most of them are struggling to get by. So what that means is that they're hiring, first of all, by and large, APCs, PAs and NPs over physicians for staffing cost reasons, and often new graduates. So now you're taking somebody who has the least experience of any licensed clinician and putting them in a place where they have no support and asking them to see 3 to 4 patients an hour. And like I said before, even though it doesn't seem like a big deal at the time, how they work up a cough, for example, that decision does have major implications in terms of that person's downstream trajectory through the healthcare system. And because iatrogenesis, if you don't know, is the number 3 cause of death in our country, just behind heart disease and cancer, it's really important that we don't do much for people who don't need much. And that's really my, bringing it all back to your original question, why I think quality in urgent care is so important is because this is a decisive moment in how these people interact with the healthcare system. And we can limit their risk of iatrogenic harm by treating minor things without doing too much appropriately, while simultaneously not missing the needle in the haystack, kind of dangerous things that do need more attention.
You mentioned some important issues, quality and business being two of the big ones. When we look at quality, any specialty or subspecialty, and let's go ahead and think of urgent care as a subspecialty, which it is in some ways, you are working with the Journal of Urgent Care Medicine to apply some science to the landscape of urgent care. Tell us about how we begin to collect data about urgent care and how we begin to improve it through science.
That's a great question. So, I've been the editor for the Journal of Urgent Care Medicine now for 5 years. I took over in the beginning of 2020, and immediately we had COVID. So that was an opportunity, like it was for all of urgent care, to sort of step up. And urgent care being the preferred testing site through most of the pandemic, we were able to start publishing research. When I had taken over, the journal's been around for roughly 20 years. So the last 5 years have been my tenure. And before that, I think there was 1 or 2 papers that were published that were actually research studies. It was by and large review articles and case reports, and no aspersion to the prior editor in chief. But I had a different vision, and I really saw that there was this vacuum of knowledge that we had about these patients. And working in urgent care and the emergency department, I knew that I was seeing a different patient population, whether or not they had the same complaints. They had a different risk of poor outcomes. And if we didn't study that in some systematic way, then we wouldn't be able to know how to treat these patients appropriately. It sounds very basic to say, but for example, a really classic case that we'll see in urgent care is a patient where we're thinking they may have a pulmonary embolism, and you apply the PERC rule, which was derived and validated. Jeff Klein did wonderful work, but derived and validated in emergency departments. And not uncommonly, a patient will have a heart rate of 101 or have, one of these other criteria that they're not able to be cleared clinically through the PERC rule. My sense is that almost all those patients are not going to have a PE if there's just one element of the PERC score that they barely fail, but we can't use that rule. So how useful would it be to have a rule that's derived and validated in urgent care, and then those parameters can be liberalized, and we wouldn't know what that is without studying it. We could use the same thing for the heart score and any clinical decision rule. But by taking what we have available, which is largely emergency department derived clinical decision instruments, we're far over triaging patients for when we're considering these risks of diseases. There's many other examples of how we're operating sort of with the wrong set of data, but that's just one that comes to mind. So since I took over, we've started publishing and have published original research monthly, and a lot of it comes from urgent care, not all of it, but the goal is to get as much as we can data from the patients that are actually being seen in urgent care so we can understand that population. Hopefully, eventually, my goal would be to, in all this, is that like ACEP has guidelines for practice. It would be great if the UCA, the Urgent Care Association, or the College of Urgent Care Medicine, which I sit on the board of, is a clinical side of that organization, developed urgent care specific guidelines to, as guidelines are intended, give guidance to the clinicians. And because these are, again, like largely over 65, 70% at this point are APCs practicing in isolation. If they had guidelines to follow, then I think they would feel a lot more comfortable caring for patients and seeing them quickly, not ordering too many tests. And when you're uncertain and you're a novice clinician, you've been there yourself, Till, you probably can remember, the tendency is to do more for the patient. And these are exactly the patients who are doing more is actually worse. And I wrote an editorial years ago in the journal about how little most urgent care patients need. And it's called What Happens If We Do Nothing. And it's the urgent care generally is a perfect a place to embody that axiom of don't just do something, stand there. But then the question also becomes, how do you make patients feel like they got value out of their visit when you don't do much? So I said a lot there. I'll let you ask any follow-up questions.
You did, but it's all very relevant. We all can think back to our experiences. I've actually worked in an urgent care center before. A couple of friends of mine opened one, and I worked there, and then have also worked a bit in an austere environment in a national park. And it's an interesting situation to be in where you don't have all the things that you have in a big, busy emergency department. You may only have a very simple battery of blood tests, a very simple battery. You don't have ultrasound. You don't have many things that you would have even in a freestanding emergency department, much less in an emergency department. And you do learn to do more with less or do less with less, which is actually probably more appropriate. And as I think to education, this is something that we're probably not very good at teaching our residents because our residents operate in places with everything and are penalized sometimes for not doing a long list of things because that's the nature of academics. So this is an important environment to think about and to try to apply some science to that. I do want to ask a bit about that environment. You've worked in urgent care centers more than I have, but I've also worked there. And from a wellness standpoint, you and I both watched the discussions among our colleagues about, well, I'll just back off and go work in urgent care centers and make my life easier and more predictable. That may sound good to people who maybe are scaling back from emergency medicine. What's the reality of working in an urgent care center that people need to know about?
Yeah, I think it's such a common question that I get actually from my colleagues when I'm working in an emergency department shift. And I definitely have um, mentorship might be too strong of a word, but kind of counseled clinicians that are transitioning to an urgent care practice, and most of them have been happy with that decision. I always come back to the why. Why are you unhappy with emergency medicine? Because if your unhappiness stems from having to deal with patients with unrealistic expectations, that's going to be true anywhere you practice. I will say I have a sort of list in my head of the benefits of urgent care compared to the emergency department for the things that are frustrating to the average emergency physician, and that includes no night shifts. Probably the older you get, the more the no night shifts
Mhm.
becomes increasingly important. But there's also in the fact that you have less support, there are less people that you have to deal with, and that communication is much more streamlined. You have usually one MA, maybe a radiology tech, and yourself. So there's a very small team, and you don't have to worry about being interrupted as much by consultants. There's nobody being rushed in that needs to be seen immediately so that you need to be pulled out of what you're doing. So there's far fewer interruptions. There are not borders. You're not taking sign out. You're not dealing with patients that have severe mental health disorders and are on hold. It's rare to see a patient who's severely intoxicated. Most of these patients, because they are ambulatory and often have sort of normal lives in air quotes, they are higher functioning. So there's just less frustration about people not being able to manage very simple aspects of taking care of themselves and their health. People have, I would say, even though the expectations are different, they do have more reasonable expectations because you're not in a 10-story hospital. The fact that you can't get an MRI in 10 minutes is not met with as much uh, reluctance or resistance. But you do have to see patients quickly. It's very repetitive. If you look at the top five chief complaints, they make up about 80 to 90% of the cases that you're going to see. So, if between ear pain, cough, sore throat, um, and urinary tract infections, that's probably 80% of the cases you're going to see. So you have to be, comfortable that you're not going to have as much intellectually stimulating sort of medical stuff to solve, but you are on the flip side going to have more of a normal a work life experience, and you're going to be dealing with more normal people. So if you still enjoy that aspect of the doctor patient interaction, and the distractions are what get to you, or the people that are unreasonable, or you're being asked to resuscitate, patients that are in diapers and 95 years old and haven't spoken in years, like that is kind of the situation where I would say it would be worth trying urgent care. And I also just should say it's not an all or nothing thing. I've been doing both for over a decade, and it's very easy to switch between the two, especially since they're shift work. If you don't mind a locums assignment, or even maybe a half-time assignment in urgent care with a locums emergency department, that's kind of what's worked well for me. And the pay is a bit less, I'll be honest, in urgent care, but I feel like prioritizing your health and sanity, especially in your mid-career, and hopefully your finances have become a little bit more stable. You could take a bit of a pay cut for the sake of not shortening your life or your career.
That's great advice. I think one other thing I want to just ask you a bit about is the business of running an urgent care center, because we probably both have friends who think, oh, yeah, I'll just go set one up and run it. You mentioned that many of them have a 1% margin, which means some of them have less and some of them may have a little more. It's not a license to print money. It's a tough business. Any other insights about running that business for those who might be thinking, oh, yeah, I can do that?
Yeah, it's inherently, from a business standpoint, business economics standpoint, it's inherently a risky business because the revenue stream is so stochastic and so seasonally variable as well. So if you've ever worked retail, I had to uh, put in my time as a retail worker in high school and college, and I was mostly seasonal. And I remember the businesses in the malls that I worked in, they basically made about 80% of their revenue during the Christmas season, and they were able to work around that. But their overhead was relatively low outside of that. The overhead of an urgent care is not insignificant, even though they don't have a lot of resources. Having an X-ray technician, having a medical assistant, and a clinician there is a pretty expensive fixed cost, and there's all kinds of regulatory and compliance expenses. So there are high fixed costs, and if you're trying to treat everything, um, and a lot of emergency medicine physicians have that mindset, right? Anyone, anywhere,
Right.
anytime, then you can end up spending a lot of money on things that you're using very infrequently, or treating things that are overly complex for dealing with in urgent care. So the the decision to go into urgent care should be, first of all, based on a lot of research and certainty that's what you want to do is run your own urgent care. I would say the landscape is particularly a lot more competitive right now, and where you open it up, all these kind of things are very, very important. But I don't want to dissuade anyone from it. Just do your homework is what my advice would be. But the work in urgent care uh, is very rewarding from without running one kind of standpoint. I will say though that the value that urgent care can offer, I think, most to the health ecosystem, like I mentioned before, in terms of treating this huge spectrum of patients with acute issues, is not to try to see a couple of patients with abdominal pain and chest pain who could have been potentially not sent to the ER instead, or fixing, a child who got bit by a pit bull and you have to spend an hour in their like repairing multiple facial lacerations. The value is really keeping all of the URIs out of the emergency department.
Mhm.
And to your initial point about frustration that emergency physicians have about people being sent from urgent care is they're not seeing the uh, denominator, they're seeing the numerator. And the denominator is quite huge. Like I mentioned, 200 million visits. That if urgent care just disappeared, a colleague and friend, Dr. Raj Garia, wrote a hypothetical scenario sort of editorial that we published. What if all the urgent cares went away? And it's an interesting thought exercise because if all these patients didn't have urgent care to go to, not all of them would go to the ER. Many of them would just, manage their symptoms at home or wait for their primary care, but many of them would. So what urgent cares can do to benefit not only the healthcare ecosystem but themselves is be really good at treating the few complaints that make up 80 to 90%. It's kind of Pareto's law, 80-20. Be really good at that. And then things that are more complex, realize that you can't be everything to everyone when you're in a 2,000 square foot clinic, in a strip mall, and send those patients, even if you're pretty sure that you could be confident just with an EKG that the patient isn't having an MI or something like that. It takes a lot of your staff time to get someone set up for an EKG. These kind of things add up. And so what really, if you're wanting to open urgent care and be successful, is the model that has proven to be the most successful is get people in and out fast that have basic things, and the people that don't have two basic things, do a screening evaluation, but don't be ashamed to have to send patients to the emergency department, especially knowing that if you were on the receiving end, you might roll your eyes because the emergency physicians that have that perspective are just overworked and frustrated, but they're not experiencing the reality of what you're dealing with, nor are they experiencing the reality of what it takes to keep one of these businesses open. And you have to survive before you can thrive.
This is great information. I think that the 200 million visits number is astounding. And I think it does speak to our need to look at the denominator a lot when we're thinking just about the numerator of things we see and the contributions the urgent care system makes to our overall healthcare system that is changing rapidly around us. Thank you for all you're doing to bring science and quality work and growth to the urgent care space, and also working with national organizations and shining a light on the important work that urgent care does. You are in multiple places, as many people are now, social media and otherwise. Tell our listeners how they can find you and find out more about your work in the urgent care space.
Sure. Well, I have a much smaller social media footprint than maybe would be the best for my personal brand, but I have an X account. It's at UC Practice Tips, and um, I have a LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect there. And I will say that I'm always putting out a plug for MRAP's work in this space for education. So we have a podcast that I'm the editor of, hosted by Mike Weinstock and Gita Pensa, two fantastic emergency and urgent care physicians. So check out that podcast. The Journal of Urgent Care Medicine is jucm.com. It's free, open access. You can get a PDF for free every month if you want it. And finally, almost everybody that publishes in our journal is a rare or never sort of author. And if you're interested in even just writing up a case report of something you saw that would be interesting to urgent care clinicians, or if you want to do research, even all the better. But we're always looking for new authors, and I assure you the bar to entry for publication is going to be lower than any other journal that you might submit to. But there is a vacuum of people doing this kind of work, and if you're working in the emergency medicine community, you're used to all these different researchers that are tackling problems ranging from is Flomax good or bad for kidney stones, and studying that 35 times. And we just have a blue ocean of opportunity to just ask very basic questions about who these patients are in urgent care and what they're doing. So please give it some thought if you're interested in the work that you're doing having a disproportionate impact on the future of the care of a lot of patients.
Great. Thank you for that. And thanks, Dr. Russell, for joining us today and sharing important perspectives about urgent care that people perhaps don't think about that much, but really is something that you're shining a light on. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Till. Hope to chat with you more.
And thank you for joining us in this installment of our M-Centric podcast series, The Shift Report. And special thanks to Dr. Joshua Russell for sharing his important insights. For more content, networking, and innovation in the world of emergency medicine, please visit mcentric.org.